Hi everyone, thanks for joining me on Sealed for Good. As it's starting to warm up out there and we get to the summer months now, big one always comes up this time of year: how do you treat your waterproofing application, particularly with liquid membranes in the warmer weather? A lot of factors to take into account. So firstly, some of the tips that you need to understand with the warmer weather: the times of application, the time when you lay your membrane down, but the most important thing is surface temperature. Now, if you look at the Gripset data sheets, and I know a lot of our competitors are in the same boat, but look at the Gripset data sheets, when we refer to surface temperature on when the product can be applied, it's the surface temperature. If you're doing a roof area or a balcony or an external deck and the forecast is 30 degrees and you get out there and you can feel it warm, it might be 30 out in the ambient temperature, but on the surface it could be 35, 40 or greater. Okay, that is that is what you need to measure and understand, that because that is where data sheets will tell you the limitations of the surface temperature when the membrane can be applied and what it can handle. Now, you might be working on a substrate. Normally, once the membrane is down and it bonds and it starts to dry, if the temperature starts to rise outside, the surface temperature might increase later, but your membrane is down and it will dry and cure okay. But if the temperature on the surface is at the maximum and is going to start heating up further, and take aware of this, because with things like concrete and even sky-on substrates, they can absorb heat. If you're working on roofs like box gutters, it's a no-brainer with metal surfaces, but don't underestimate the amount of heat and the absorption of things like concrete and even some of these other synthetic surfaces that are used on substrates, because they will hold the heat and that can affect the adhesion of your membrane and your primer. So please be aware of that before you just dive in. Application tools, okay? Make sure, you should always be doing this anyway, but when you're using your rollers, ensure that before you actually start using any liquid membrane with it, you dampen the nap of the roller before you dip it in the bucket, and ensure that you don't just have a dry roller where you're laying that out. And when you're working the membrane on the surface, I tend to always recommend that just try an area, even if you have boards in your van or your vehicle, and just let it stay out in the sun for a little while, prime it, and just roll it out and just see what the behaviour is of the membrane before you start putting the larger floor, because that'll give you a tip on if it's starting to cook out there, particularly with your wet edge finish that you want, particularly on an external membrane. Now, if it's an area you're going to be tiling over, wet edge finishes might not be so critical, but if it's a finished floor area like a roofing section or a plant room where it's going to be exposed to weather, you want to make sure that your finish looks good and your wet edge is going to be impacted by that temperature. So take that into account, and it's always a good tip. Just have some boards around. You might pick up on site some offcuts, try it on that, and then that'll actually give you an idea of how it's going to behave in that situation. Now, the other part is your membrane. If you've got a specification, let's say someone specified C1P or 2P on an application, cementitious membranes behave a lot different than a 1 part liquid membrane in warm weather. Why? Because as we know, cement hydrates, and so all the water will hydrate a lot quicker. So you need to understand that, for example, C1P, if you're using that on a warmer day, sometimes you might just not use the tap water. You might need to cool it down, ice it, and so have a bucket with a bit of ice and use colder water to mix it up. It'll give you a longer pot life and a bit more working time. Okay, good tip for you. But be aware that always a cementitious system, and those guys that are using, tilers have been working with cement-based tile adhesives, renderers, even laying a screed down, anything cement-based, you've got less working time. Whether you've got additives that can help in that situation, but make sure you apply common sense to your application. Don't just treat it like you've been working on a day when it was shady or the temperature was cooler, because you're going to be limited. You might need to work in the cool part of the day very early or in the late part of the day where there's shade. But you just can't go that way and just treat it like you would normally. Otherwise, have a talk to your client or us if you want, and see with the application you can have a conversion and go to one of the 1 part membranes for the application that you can actually use for the same area, and understand whether that is a good alternative or not. If you've got doubts about that, give us a call. Our tech team is there to help you on 1-800-650-435, and ensure also you're aware of what the temperature is after your application. So if you're working internally or you're under shade, if it's warm outside but you haven't got direct sun on the membrane, you tend to get a decent drying film. But if that's going to be out in the heat of the day, so even if you know there's going to be 40 that day, and on a roof that temperature could be really beaming down on there, what you have is a situation where you might get the membrane down on the surface at the right temperature, but then that sun hits the membrane and it can fry it, particularly if it's a membrane that's going to require a time to dry. So just be aware of that. Don't try and push the boundaries in hot weather conditions, particularly when it's a finished membrane application, because that can bugger up the final job, impacts your reputation, and also ends up reflecting on the membrane. And it's just about near dealing with the weather gods. You need to understand how that works. Any questions on that, let us know. Those who've been through our training department know how to handle these conditions. If you're interested in that, we've got the advice for you on that as well. But get some questions to us if you want, and we'll help you in how to handle your waterproofing application in those warm conditions. And don't forget the sunscreen and a hat. See you next time.